People start coming in. So welcome to those who are arriving. We're just starting up now to let people in, and we plan to start hopefully on time in 3 minutes. So welcome to those who have joined already. We're just going to wait another couple of minutes for more to join. You'll see there's both a chat and a Q&A button at the bottom. Q&A, please keep for questions about the presentation. In the chat, please feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself for everyone else. Start chatting in the chat. None of you can speak unless we give permission to speak. So but you can use the chat and Q&A both. So do feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you. And so we'll start in a couple of minutes now. Rajesh, the participant chat is disabled apparently. Can you take care of that?
Sure. Chat is enabled for everyone.
So please confirm when it's done so we can then.
It's done.
Encourage people to go there.
It's done. Chat is enabled for everyone.
Okay, everyone, you can now please introduce yourself in the chat. Let's get started. It's gone by. So welcome everybody. This presentation is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, you have been warned. You can't anyway speak or be seen, so not that much to fear. If you feel free to introduce yourselves on the chat, which now is enabled for everyone, I'm told. If it's not, please again let us know. The Q&A is reserved for the questions you may have on the presentation, please. And likely I will read from the Q&A to answer questions at the end, depending on the volume of questions I might otherwise ask you to speak. This talk will send out a copy of the Q&A and responses and the PowerPoint to all participants, registered participants, after probably tomorrow now. And the talk itself will be available on the GDN, Global Development Network, YouTube channel. And I'm still getting another message that chat's not activated for participants, still disabled, Rajesh. People are still not able to use it. So we'll be working on that. Rajesh will let you know when it's sorted out. Let me share my screen and go from there. So when I was looking through the participant list this morning, I found that there were quite a lot of people signed up that I don't know you, which is good, reaching out to more people. So I thought maybe I should give a short introduction to myself also. My name's Howard White, and I started working with impact evaluation over 20 years ago now, when I went to the World Bank Evaluation Group, IEG, to lead the impact evaluation program there. And then I left there in 2008 to set up the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, so I was the first director of 3IE. Then I left 3IE to become the CEO of the Campbell Collaboration, the Global Evidence Synthesis body. I can see people are putting themselves in the chat now, so chat now is working. So I was CEO of Campbell for 6 years, just about 7 years, which is a global body of evidence synthesis, systematic reviews and evidence maps. And then I left Campbell and I'm now director of the Evaluation Evidence Synthesis Program at the Global Development Network, GDN, which is an international organization devoted to promoting high quality research from developing country researchers. So this particular work I'm presenting now has had a variety of funders, but the main funders being the European Commission. None of these products are yet approved by the European Commission, so it's still work in progress, as you'll see. And so this is not endorsed or approved by the EC, but is being supported by them. I also have mentioned, I also have a part-time position as Professor of Evidence-Based Public Policy at Lanzhou University in China. So I have both logos up there. Some of the work I'll be presenting has been done by researchers at Lanzhou. So this is a global project. We've got a range of different products, evidence products we're producing that are listed there, and I'll go through these. You'll see all of these products during the course of this talk. And they've been produced in collaboration with researchers, mostly from Africa and Asia. So in Africa, it's mainly the Africa Centre for Knowledge Translation Systematic Reviews and Makerere University. And in Asia, it's both a group-based global development network called Campbell South Asia, some of GDN, some of Campbell South Asia, with a couple of Filipino researchers also working with that group, one of who's now moved to Lanzhou, and then with Lanzhou University itself as well, working on the map of maps. So it's really a global evidence. So it's very consistent with what GDN does. So the GDN Evaluation Evidence Program, we bid for work. We haven't got any core funding. We funded entirely by bidding for research work and research evaluation work, and doing that work with developing country researchers and funding ourselves and themselves through that model. And we're building up our network to do that. And so this work is an example of the type of things that we're doing. So evidence and gap maps. Before I looked at the presentation, the participant list this morning, I sort of assumed everyone would know what an evidence and gap map is, and that may not be true. So I've got an example coming up on youth employment, and I've put in some additional slides showing how it works in case you're not familiar with them. The main thing about them is they take a fairly broad scope of an intervention area, in this case youth employment, and they identify all relevant studies. Now, relevant studies is defined in a certain way. Most evidence and gap maps, particularly those by 3IE, are what we call effectiveness maps. They only include impact evaluations. Now, the maps that we do, I mean, I've done since I went to Campbell and I come still at GDN, is that we also include process evaluations. So we include both impact evaluations and process evaluations, but they are evaluations. They have to be studies of an intervention to improve youth employment or related outcomes like skills development and so on. So they're not just any study of youth employment, studies of the status of youth employment, trends in youth employment, lived experience of unemployed youth. Those would not be included. They're not intervention studies. They're useful research to answer different research questions. We're interested in research questions around interventions to do something about youth employment. The maps show, and the youth employment map now, there are just over 1,000 studies, 1,023 studies in this map, evaluations. The maps show what evidence is available. They don't say what that evidence says. They have study-wide summaries for each study in the map. There's a summary of that study, but there's not a summary across the study. Don't say, okay, what do these 1,000-odd studies tell us about what was to do youth employment? Maps don't do that, and I'll elaborate on that later on. So it's not in the slide, but there's like a typology of evidence and gap maps. A normal evidence and gap map will be a map of identifying existing primary studies, impact evaluations, process evaluations in a particular field, and any systematic reviews. What we call a mega map just shows existing maps and reviews. So it doesn't include the primary studies. So you do a mega map, you've got a broader scope. So we've done mega maps of child welfare, was the first one we ever did, and WHO is doing mega maps around elder abuse, and yes, elder abuse, they've done a mega map. And then we have a map of maps, which, as the name says, is a map of all available maps in the international development space. So there are a growing number of maps now in developed country policy focus. We've done one on homelessness, for example, and we've got one I'll show you on youth offending. So they're not included in the map of maps. We're only including maps that have a developing country focus, low middle income country as their main focus around the SDGs. So the first map of maps done in 2017 as part of a project called SEDAL, which I ran as research director. And so at the start of that, we did a map of maps to identify new areas where maps were needed and hadn't been done. And now it's been updated by the Centre for Evidence-Based Social Sciences at Atlanta University. If you're interested in how to do a map, there's two possibilities. 3i have their own software for it, but we in Campbell, I've had many hats. We in Campbell, we commissioned the Epicentre at University College London to produce something called EpiMapper, which produces the map using data encoded in a software called EpiReviewer. EpiReviewer is one of the main softwares used for producing systematic reviews and now maps. So we do the coding of all the studies in EpiReviewer, and then we export a file from that to generate the map in EpiMapper. Maps are mainly grey literature. So when you do a systematic review, you do a search of many academic databases, and that finds most of your studies. Then you do some supplementary searching of websites and so on to find additional studies that haven't been published. EGMs do not, by and large, get published in academic journals. There are few exceptions, but by and large don't. They're commissioned by agencies like USAID, and they use them for their own purpose, and they may put them on their website, but they don't go beyond that. And so we've done just recently, the Lounge team did machine learning based search, which in a platform called OpenAlex, which is billions of studies that cover all the major databases. And they didn't find a single new EGM that could be included in the map of maps from that search. The way we find maps to go in the map of maps, and the way we found them in the first map of maps that was done in 2017 is by reaching out to people producing maps. We put advertise on Twitter, which now doesn't work anymore, through LinkedIn and so on. And so if you're doing an EGM and you think we haven't got it, then please just send it to us and we can include it. We want to include every possible map. We're very keen on making sure all our products are used. So there's a fairly new initiative called the Global SDG Evidence Coalition, and we've provided them with the map of maps, and they've been using it to identify existing other evidence maps. I see it as a cascade. Here's the map of maps, here are other evidence and gap maps, and then here are the systematic reviews in those maps, and then here's all the primary studies, organized by the SDGs and these various pillars that the coalition has organized around the SDGs. So there's already a systematic review by the coalition on climate change, and we're currently involved in producing one for them on peacekeeping for the SDGs. So this is what the map looks like. This is what all maps look like, basically, in the new generation of maps. This style of map was started when I was at 3IE. It wasn't my idea, it was Ricardo's idea. But we went and ran with it. They proved to be very popular. And they organize, generally, you can draw them any way you want, but generally these evidence maps organized by rows and columns where the row headings are intervention categories and the column headings are outcome categories. And in the case of the map of maps, the intervention categories are the intervention categories the World Bank uses, and the outcomes are the SDGs. And so this is not, the online versions are interactive, so you can click on a cell and get access to the actual map shown in the map of maps. I'll show how that works when we get to youth employment map. I'm not going to show it here for this map. What's interesting is to see the way the EGMs have grown. As I've said, we first introduced them back in 2010. We did one on agriculture and nutrition. That's the first map we did. And there's a small number in the first few years till people got to know about them and get excited about them. And so they started to take off then. And then you see it up to 2016. I think it drops down after that, not because they dropped down. That's because the first edition of Map Maps done in 2017, so they got all the maps up to 2016, and then we sort of started again when we've just done the most recent update this year. And so you see this growth up to 2023 again. And I think some of the maps produced in 2017, 2018, maybe they're not still in the public domain. They were done 6-7 years ago now. The maps date very quickly because you've got a broad scope for a map. So we update the youth employment map at least once a year and sometimes twice a year. And we get each time another 100 studies. And there's a couple of maps like on homelessness we update every year. Every year we're going to have 100 studies or more. And so an old map is a dated map, it's not of much use. And so if the maps from 2017 or so on, we probably can't find them anymore. They're probably not out there anymore. So you see this dip. The problem is it wasn't a real dip, but it's one that now when we go back to try to update, we can't find those studies. But what you do see is that these things didn't exist 15 years ago. Now there's over 100 of them. Yeah, so they become evidence gap maps have become very popular. And we included the domestic, well, I call it domestic policy because I come from the UK. If we include developed country evidence gap maps as well, then you wouldn't double this number, but you'd increase it by 40-50%. And that would be mostly in the last 5-6 years since Campbell endorsed evidence gap maps, and it started to grow from there. Now, in my view, maps are instrumental products. A map, an evidence gap map is not an end in itself, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So I think you should use evidence gap map for some other purpose. That's what I mean by being an instrumental product. And the main purpose is to actually build the evidence architecture. So this is a diagram you may have seen before. I hope you have, because I've been promoting it like anything since I first published it in a Nature article some 5 years ago now. And the idea is of this evidence pyramid. It's not the evidence pyramid that people from the health sector in particular might be familiar with RCTs review at the top, because RCTs are the best type of thing you can do. I don't agree with that view anyway, but this is not going up by quality of evidence. As you move up this pyramid, the evidence is becoming more heavily curated or more brokered. You've got, as you move up the pyramid, you're adding value to the evidence through curation. I'll explain what I mean by that. So we go through the different levels fairly quickly. There are various publications I've got, including Nature article, explain this in more detail. And I have a book coming out called Evidence-Based Public Policy, published by Lander University Press, which goes into a lot of detail, the sort of things that I'm talking about in this lecture. Not lecture, this talk. So you start at the bottom pyramid with data. Data by themselves are not evidence. To become evidence, they need to be analysed. So you often see statements that make me very annoyed, where they'll say, "Oh, we'll look at the data to see what works." You can't look at the data to see what works. You need to analyse the data to learn what works. So such statements, which you hear from some major international organisations, are simply nonsense. So we're going to analyse the data, and we analyse the data in primary studies. So primary studies are the bedrock of the evidence pyramid. Data as well, if you read the papers I've written around the evidence architecture in education, the evidence architecture in social isolation and loneliness, you'll see that I discuss quite a lot about the need for data and improving data and standardizing outcomes and so on. So you've got data, but the primary studies analyze those data. And of course, evidence synthesis and maps and reviews can apply to any research question. But I said at the beginning, what we're particularly interested in here is evidence-bound effectiveness and implementation issues around interventions. So we look at intervention research. But in principle, this pyramid could apply to any area of research. So you do primary studies, and those primary studies get summarized in systematic reviews. Now, when I started 3IE, the first ever products we commissioned were systematic reviews. I didn't know much about them at that stage, but I've become very evangelical about them. Traditional literature reviews, which many sectors, particularly in social sciences, still rely on, have many sources of bias. When a commissioner tells me, oh, we're not going to do a systematic review, they take too long, they're too expensive, we're just going to get an expert and we're going to pay them to do a literature review, I say, don't bother, just ask her what she thinks already, because that's what her literature review will say. There are so many inbuilt biases in literature review that someone will write the review to support their priors, what they already believe to be the case. The systematic review is done in a way as to reduce possible sources of bias. And by bias, we mean in a statistical sense of what we find is systematically different from the true value. But actually, part of the reason for that bias is people's cognitive biases in terms of confirmation bias and so on. So systematic reviews seek to minimize this bias. Then you've got these different types of created evidence. You've got databases. So 3i has a database. They call it a portal. It's not. It's still a database. It was always a database when I was there, which is studies, impact evaluations, reviews, international development. You've got the Global Policing Database on criminology. You've got Epistemologos, which is a review of systematic reviews and primary studies in the health sector. You've got ERIC in the education sector. So you've got sectory dedicated databases. You don't have anything like that in the youth employment space. The nearest you've probably got is VocEd in Australia, which is a vocational education database. So it's good in that area. Other areas of employment not so strong because it's focused on vocational education. But there's no dedicated database globally for youth employment. You've got some evidence platforms like Decent Jobs for Youth. I don't like platforms. I'll come on to say that in a second. Databases, when they're done properly, have some clear inclusion criteria. These types of study we're going to include. So, for example, ERIC is an education research database, includes all education research. The 3i database, international development, but only impact evaluation reviews, only effectiveness studies. So they've got a clear inclusion criteria. So you have evidence maps, I've shown them already. They take what's in a database. Databases are normally very broad in scope, all of education, all of international development, all of health. Okay, so they're very broad. Evidence maps are narrower than that, and they're more curated. In a database, you just have, you have a description, there's some keywords or something in a database, and they've obviously coded the bibliographic information, so you can search by author name, title, and so on. You can maybe search words in the abstract. The evidence map's got an additional level of curation, whereby in doing a map, you've decided on some intervention categories, some outcome categories, and you've coded all the studies by those, and some filters like country, region, income group. So you can go into map and say, I just want impact evaluations from Africa, apply the filters, and the map shows you here are the available impact evaluations from Africa. So the maps are very flexible. They're like a database, but you have to search them slightly differently, but they've got more information than the database normally would have. Partly because they do what's called critical appraisal, which I won't go into in more detail. Then you've got evidence platforms, which I'm very ambivalent about, to say the best. They generally have a resource section, maybe a blog and events and so on, but they're under curated in that they don't normally have any clear inclusion criteria. So Decent Jobs for Youth, anything about youth employment. And there's no critical appraisal, which tells you, is this a good study or not a good study? How much confidence can I have in the findings of the study, which you do have in the evidence maps. And there's no attempts to be comprehensive. When you're doing an evidence map, you do a systematic search, which attempts to be fully comprehensive. So if you go to that map, you know they've included all the studies they could find. Whereas an evidence platform is a hodgepodge collecting resources people sent in, the secretariat came across. It's not the same sort of thing. So I think evidence platforms, they're not as useful as they might be, but the bad thing is that people do them and think, oh, we'll take care of evidence now, we've done an evidence platform, but you haven't. Because to take care of evidence, to really get evidence used in decision making, you've got to go above that dotted line to EBDMPs. EPDMPs are evidence-based decision-making products, EPDMPs. And the key thing why that line is there is evidence-based decision-making products allow decision makers to make decisions based on the evidence without having to go back and read the studies. Now, evidence platforms, evidence maps, databases take you back to the research studies. Decision makers do not read research studies. There are exceptions, of course, but most decision makers do not read research studies. And anyway, we don't want them to read one research study and say, oh, look, this thing worked here, in Albania, let's do it in Alberta, or vice versa. You've got to not know what a single study said. You want to know what the body of evidence says, which is what a systematic review tells you. So you don't want decision makers to actually go in and pull out one study from a database or a map. You want to tell them, no, we've actually assessed the whole body of evidence through a systematic review, and this is what it says. And those evidence-based it's hard to say, I'm not catching on, EPDMPs, they tell you what to do based on the evidence. Now, again, there are different levels of curation here. That's why we're going up the pyramid still, and different level agencies. So evidence portals, and they're often called toolkits or intervention tools. And I'll show you an example because what we're doing for youth employment. They say, here's the evidence around what's effective or not. And they're mostly around effectiveness. What has the biggest bang for your buck in increasing youth employment? Okay, what works and what doesn't work. So mainly informed decisions about what to do. But they say, here's the evidence on what to do. You go and decide what to do. So there's a lot of agency for decision maker. Here's the toolkit, decide what to do. Guidelines have an additional stage of creation. With guidelines, they have expert groups look at systematic reviews, and they take into account not only the evidence, but also values in the relevant context in which they're going to be doing this intervention, and also practicality of that intervention in their context, and produce guidelines for that context based on the evidence, but taking into account also practicality and values. So WHO is the organization, World Health Organization, is the organization that does this best and most well known for doing guidelines, but they're starting to come out in other sectors as well. There should be evidence-based guidelines based on systematic reviews. So they say to the decision maker, here's some recommendations. We've looked at the evidence and we've thought about it. Here's some things for you to consider. We recommend this, we recommend that, and so on. Checklists are next level up. Checklists at one level could just say, just do this. We've thought about it, we looked at the evidence, just do this. Don't think about it, just do this, based on what the evidence says. And so they're a very straightforward guide to, okay, you're doing a community-based development program, here's some things I need to do. Have I made sure I've consulted with community leaders and got their agreement to working in their community? Have I ensured there's inclusion of marginalized groups, not just women, people with disabilities, and the ethnic minority groups might be living in the area, and so on? What have I done to ensure inclusion of these groups, and so on? Just it's not telling you exactly what to do, but it's the things you've got to make sure you've taken into account. So this evidence architecture is very strongly, in my view, how we ought to be thinking about using evidence. And it's built as a pyramid because the top of the pyramid is what we want. We want the UPDMPs. We want to have guidelines and checklists and portals based on evidence. We can't have the top of the pyramid without the bottom. So the bottom of the pyramid is really important. And how do we know what's in the bottom of the pyramid, the primary study reviews? We do an evidence map. So whenever someone comes to me and says, oh, we want to do this, what you've written about, and what you've done, we want to do guidelines, whatever, I say, okay, let's start with an evidence map. That's where we've got to do an evidence map first to have a look at the base of the pyramid to know what's there. There are a lot of reviews there. We can go ahead and we can do guidelines, evidence portal, whatever you want. If there are few reviews, we've got to do reviews of the primary studies. If there are few primary studies, we just need more primary studies. You've got to look at the state of the evidence architecture at the bottom of the pyramid before you can build the top of the pyramid. I've had funders come to me and say, oh, we want to do guidelines, want to do a portal. And I say, it's fine, but there is a map in your area, and we know there are no primary studies of most interventions, so we need to invest in building the evidence architecture at the base of the pyramid first. They say, oh, we're not interested in that. But you can't build the top without the bottom. So let's look at a map now. This is Youth Employment Evidence Gap map. This work is done almost entirely by the team at Macquarie University. So that's why you see their logo up there. This is a slightly old version of the map. We've got a more recent version now with another 130 odd studies, which I'll show in a second. So again, we see here's the intervention categories. So you've got categories and subcategories. So first category is training, upskilling, retraining, reskilling, and then you've got that broken under subcategories. With the first and most important is TVET, technical vocational education and training. Then you've got internships and apprenticeships. Then you've got training center accreditation certification. Then you've got training of trainers and teachers, and so on. Then you've got another category of categories around private sector development, around financial support. You'll see them in the subsequent slide. Then you've got different outcomes. So you've got education and skills outcomes, you've got employment outcomes, you've got other outcomes related to welfare and so on going across. Again, you'll see in the subsequent slide. It has all these bubbles. The size of a bubble represents the number of studies, and they're color-coded according to two things, whether it's an impact, whether it's a primary study or a systematic review. And systematic reviews are the origin green dots. You'll see there are not many of those. And the colors relate to whether it's a deemed to have high confidence in the study findings or medium confidence study findings or low confidence, which is the red. Now you can hover over any particular cell, like hovering, this is the more recent version, hovering over the cell there for the effect of TVET on employment outcomes, and it gives you a list there of, okay, we've got 166 low confidence primary studies, 72 medium high confidence primary studies, 8 medium high confidence reviews, and 5 low confidence reviews. The confidence comes from a critical appraisal we've done of the studies as part of the coding for these 1,000 studies in this map. When you click on a cell, so we click on that cell there, then you get a list of all the records in that cell. So 251 records in that cell. Here they are listed. You can sort them by author and sort by date. Oh, you sort by title, and you sort by date and by author as well. And you can click on any one record in that list, and you get an abstract, a summary of that study. But at the bottom of that abstract, you get a URL link. So you click on that URL link, it takes you to the paper itself. Now, the paper might be behind a paywall. We do our best to find an unpaywalled version and put the URL in for that into the map, but sometimes you hit a paywall, you can't access the study itself, depending on the access your institution has. But why people like these maps is not only does it make all the evidence available in navigable form, it actually gives you access to the studies themselves. So here's 1,000 studies on youth employment. So I said there's no database on youth employment. Well, there is now. Okay, we've been doing this map since 2000. The first version only had 400 studies in it, and the current version has over 1,000. So it's been growing all the time. It's been funded in the past by MasterCard, first of all, Youth Futures Foundation on an ongoing basis, and as I mentioned, the European Commission. So thank you to all of them for funding our work. And you can access the studies through the map. But the maps don't summarize what this evidence says. Now, but it still has findings. The findings are, well, what are those studies? What are they about? What type of study are they? Where are they from? They're the findings you get from a map. So they are findings, they're research findings. We did some research, identified all the youth employment evaluations, and we coded them against various characteristics, and we're showing them here in this map, so in these tables. So the first thing is that you've got these different intervention categories. So training, like TVET, support to employment is things like giving young people interview technique, so you could train them in interview technique, talking to them about what training needs they might have and so on. Decent work policies are mainly around labour standards. Labour market information systems can either be giving information to young people on what sort of jobs are in demand, or to firms, employers, on what skills are currently available in the labour market. Private sector development is, as the name suggests, intervention to support private sector activity. You don't see many studies there. It doesn't mean there aren't studies in the area, but the studies or the interventions had to be targeted at young people, which we define as being up to age 35. The interventions have to be targeted at that age group in order to get included in this map. Financial incentives includes wage subsidies, but also microfinance, grants, startup kits, and so on. And cross-cutting refers to youth outreach and gender inclusive approaches. So you can break each of those categories broken down into subcategories. I'm not showing that here. And the green shows that there's a relatively large number of studies. You see the largest cell is 330, and now in the updated version of the map, it's 251, the one I showed you, of the effect of TVET on employment outcomes. There are a lot of studies, and a third of the studies in the map talk about that. Now, if you look at the bottom, you'll see that over half the studies are impact evaluations. just over a third, 40% of process evaluations, and just 3% systematic reviews, and a very small number which are mixed methods, meaning both impact and process evaluations. So this is a very low share of systematic reviews. If you do a map in the health sector, don't on a disability, then nearly half the included studies are reviews, and nearly as many reviews there are included primary studies. Whereas in some other sectors, it's like 10, 15%. Here it's just 3%. This is a really under-reviewed area. So there's two global reviews, one that 3i Finance and Campbell published by Joachim Gouvet back in 2016, and a more recent update of that by an ILO World Bank team financed by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and their global reviews of youth employment interventions. Otherwise, there are a small number of reviews are mainly focused on youth with disabilities. And so in a sort of public health subset, because reviews are much more common in health, but reviews around public work programs and youth, around wage subsidies for youth, around the support to employment programs, they don't exist. Even for TVET, generally, there's one on TVET and in low-income countries, but there's a lack of reviews in this area. And so what we've been doing in this particular project is to do reviews in order to help build the toolkit we're going to make. So you see the green marks the well evidence area, so training and general well evidence across all outcomes. Because we include process evaluations have implementation, design of intervention implementation. They get coded in that last column. We don't code process evaluations against outcomes because process evaluations are not about how the intervention contribute to achieving a particular outcome. They're about what happened in implementing this intervention. So as Scriven puts it in his encyclopedia, process evaluation, the evaluand is the intervention, not the outcomes. An impact evaluation, the evaluand is the outcomes. So we code impact evaluations against the outcomes, but process evaluation in the design implementation column. And we have some subcategories of design implementation, like theory of change, implementation issues, barriers of participation to taking part, and facilities taking part, and so on. Under evidence areas, which is the dark orange or brownie color, private sector development clearly, entrepreneurship as an outcome is fairly weakly evidence, and the yellow is like in between. And so you see quite a lot of yellow as well. So these are relative statements. This map has 1,000 studies. We've got maps with 200, 300 studies. So all the cells would be emptier than these cells are. So when we say it's better evidence or less well evidence, that's depending on given the number of studies in the map and number of studies in other areas. And this partly reflects, of course, what the interventions are. The most common interventions you get for youth employment are training programs. And so that's where you see most of the studies. Where do they come from? So again, here's the global evidence. We're looking here not at sub-Saharan Africa only, we're looking at the global evidence. And so the United States has, well, numbers of 1,000 now, so 13% of the studies. And then there's quite a lot coming from the UK, quite a lot from Germany, and then France is quite high. But you do see some countries in Africa which is quite high. You can see Egypt up there at the top there. You can see Kenya and Uganda. You can see South Africa. Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. You can see and Uganda particularly high. So you can see a large number of studies from some sub-Saharan African countries, but a lot of them have very few studies. So like Namibia is grey, Botswana is grey. So that means then they're not having any studies at all. And so there are more studies coming from developed countries. We'll see this in a moment. So there's a distribution by country. And what's striking is that there's a different nature in interventions. So this is not a case where one thing that struck me, I mean, I worked all my career in international development, then I moved to Canada and started working on developed countries. And I was very struck by a lot of the problems in developed countries like gang violence, substance abuse, child protection are the emerging issues of importance in developing countries. Now, it's not that child mortality, bad education have gone away, but they're on their way to being more solved. And there's more with first world problems like homelessness, substance abuse, and so on, and mental health issues are emerging important in developing countries. If you want to get ahead of the curve in research in developing countries, go and write something on gangs in African cities or in gangs in India, or on homelessness in Africa, or on substance abuse in Africa. These are emerging areas of research. And good papers in those areas right now will like help define the field. Young PhD researchers do that, help define your field. I, by chance, haven't to do that in my own career, and it really does make a difference. So there's, but why I went off the point there. The key point here is, despite that, there's a difference in the nature of youth employment interventions in developing countries. Youth employment interventions in developed countries are mostly about improving employability. Here's a young person, we want to try and help them get a job. That's partly about training. It's partly about buying them a suit for their interview, giving them a transport subsidy and go to an interview, teach them interview techniques, tidying up their CV, this sort of stuff. In developing countries, the intervention is far more focused on you've got to make your own job. There's no jobs out there. Forget about getting a job. You have to make your own job. And so you see that if you look at the developing, the low middle income country versus the high income country, over a third of studies in developing countries are all intervention with business skills training, compared to less than 10% in high income countries. 20% of the studies from low middle income countries are about private sector development, less than 1% in developed countries. And actually, go to the next row, financial incentives, which includes grants and startup kits and loans and so on. It's a third versus a fifth. So it's not a sharper contrast, but the contrast is there. And so there is a substantive difference in the nature of the employment interventions in developed and developing countries. The other important thing to know is that youth employment interventions are usually multi-component. So they don't just do one thing. They don't just provide training. And so this table is quite complicated to read. I'll just take you through a couple of numbers in it. So this basically is a cross tabulation of how we've coded the intervention for a particular study against itself. Now, it might have more than one intervention category because it's covering more than one intervention. That virtually doesn't happen. So we just ignore that. That's a bit of noise. What is the case that most youth employment interventions, around 80%, include more than one component. So we look at the top number, 679, that's training against training. There are 679 studies that have a training component in them. So as I said, that's just under 70%. All the studies have a training component in them. Now, if you go to the next column, 227, that's telling us of those 679, 227, so roughly a third, also have a support to employment component. So, and this is the most common form of intervention in developed countries. A young person's unemployed, they get referred by the welfare service to the youth employment service or the employment service. They're assigned a youth counsellor, and that youth counsellor talks to the young person about their needs and their aspirations and so on, and identifies some appropriate activity for them. It's normally training. It might be a work placement, but normally it's training. And so you've got a combination of support to employment and training. As in, the third of the training interventions have support to employment with them. If you go to the next row, support to employment, there's the 227. Let's go to the 291. The 291 second column, that means there are 291 studies in this map of interventions which include support to employment. Of those, 227 also have training. So nearly all, over 80%, of the interventions offering support to employment also have a training component. So we see that, you'll see if you look at the figures, nearly everything is multi-component. And because the training is, of course, has a lot of subcategories, which I haven't shown you before in detail, something can be multi-component with a training category. So we see there are 487 TVET interventions, that's a top left number, go across to business skills training. About a quarter of those that have TVET, technical training, also have business skills training. You're going to become up your own carpentry firm, your own electrical firm. You need the technical skills as well as the business skills. So a lot of courses provide both of those. Okay, you need to become a self-employed contractor doing electricity, plumbing, brickwork. You need to also have the technical skills as well as the business skills. If you go down to life skills, it's one row from the bottom as an intervention. So there are 175 interventions providing life skills training. It's become very common. This has emerged in recent years. If you look across Africa now, everyone's doing life skills training. Okay, not everyone, but it's very common. If you go back to the left, you will see that 106 of those 175, so roughly 2/3 of life skills training, also include technical training. So it's very common to see multiple interventions. This matters. So, because a key component on what works is single component more effective because I can focus on single component, or is it better to actually combine components and actually have a multi-component intervention, which most people do. So most people believe that multiple component interventions are better. Is that true or not? We have the answer for you in this presentation, so don't go away yet. So we're building a youth employment toolkit. We haven't done it yet, so I'm first of all going to show you a different toolkit based on youth offending, done for What Works Centre in the UK. So it's a whole different topic, but the concept is the same. So we're at the top. We want to do an evidence portal. We want to do a youth employment, a young offending toolkit. It's called the Youth Endowment Fund that finances this work. So we're going to start. We first make an EGM. So we did an evidence gap match. The large EGM I've worked on over 2,000 studies. Okay, over 2,000 studies of interventions to reduce youth offending. And amazingly, it had over 200 reviews. There are 220 systematic reviews in the first edition of that map. And so it's a well-reviewed area. Over 10% of studies in the map, and a lot of studies are systematic reviews. So based on stakeholder demand, the fund of YEF, the stakeholder consultation with Home Office, charities working in the sector, what are called youth offending teams, violence reduction units, the police, and so on, what they were interested in, and if we had a suitable review on that topic. And we wrote a technical report. So it was a team that I was running for contract for YEF. We wrote a technical report based on a systematic review. So we identified a systematic review already existed, and we wrote a technical report on that. And that technical report is the basis for the toolkit. The toolkit looks like this. So in a toolkit, you have a list of interventions. So it's after-school programs, anti-bullying, boot camps, sports programs, and so on, things that might reduce youth offending. In the employment toolkit, of course, we'll have vocational training, public works, life skills training, digital interventions, categories like that that are relevant to youth employment. And there are three key metrics here. What does it cost on a scale? Is it low cost or high cost? How good is the evidence based? Because I've got high confidence in this finding or low confidence. Then what's the impact? What's the impact on youth offending? In this case, in our case, it'll be what's the impact on youth employment and youth skills. That's the top level of a toolkit. You can click on any level of a toolkit, takes you down to a second level, which describes the intervention in more detail, talks about implementation issues, who it works best with, things you need to take into account in program design. Then there's a third level of the toolkit, which is the technical report I showed you earlier. Someone wants to go in more detail, they can read the technical report. Want to go in a lot of detail, they can go to systematic review, which technical report is based. So this toolkit is all based on systematic reviews. Now, these toolkits done by UK What Works centres have substantial policy traction. So there's one on teacher and learning toolkit produced by the Education Endowment Fund, EEF. It's used by over 3/4 of schools in England. Use that toolkit to decide how to spend school resources to improve learning outcomes for disadvantaged students. The YF toolkit, the one I've just shown you, the Home Office requires what's called violence reduction units, which are in areas of the country with highest crime rates, to spend over at least 25% of their budget on interventions shown to be effective in the toolkit. Department for Education in England had a £30 million fund, and charities could bid to spend money on interventions under that fund, having to select interventions shown to be effective in the toolkit. There's an example I've not listed here where the Prime Minister wanted to do an intervention called boot camps. Toolkit shows to be harmful, and the head of YEF persuaded the Prime Minister's office to instead do an intervention called focused deterrence, which is effective, with a £7 million fund. And a lot of local authorities around England are using the toolkit to inform their crime reduction strategies. So all of these practitioners and decision makers are using evidence from systematic reviews. Not because they've read the systematic reviews, they've probably not even ever heard of systematic reviews, but because we've got an evidence-based decision-making product that tells them what the evidence says in a very usable, accessible way. And for researchers that want to influence policy, this is a dream. Okay, you've done a review that goes into the EF toolkit. You're influencing policy in 3/4 of schools across the country. How can you imagine to have such a large policy influence with your research? So these EGPMPs really lever research into policy. So this is This is the way, when we talk about knowledge translation, knowledge brokering, this is it. In my view, this is the answer to effective knowledge translation. You've got to make these evidence-based making products that guide decision makers what to do without having to go back and look at the academic studies. We're not the first ones doing this. For the last 20 years now, WHO, or a bit less than that, WHO has been doing guidelines. WHO used to its guidelines based on expert opinion. You look at these best buy documents the bank and FCDO have been funding, they're based on expert opinion. That's a discredited way of identifying the most effective interventions. The most effective interventions are based on identified through systematic reviews. So this is a WHO infographic showing reduction of their guidelines. Okay, starting on the scope, what's the guideline going to be about, coming up with recommendations at the end, and at the center of the process is evidence synthesis of both the quantitative and the qualitative evidence. And so you look at that text there, that process is that the fundamental steps in the process is evidence retrieval and synthesis, and quality appraisal, which is the critical appraisal I was mentioning earlier. So the systematic reviews are crucial, central to the process of building the evidence pyramid. So we're doing that process now. By September, it won't be out in the public domain. By the end of the year, hopefully this will be in the public domain for youth employment. Part of this process is doing the quantitative review. So for that, we do what's called a meta-analysis. The meta-analysis takes together all the impact evaluations. It looks at the effect of those interventions in those impact evaluations on different outcomes like employment and earnings and skills and so on, and averages the effects across all of its interventions, all across those different studies. And then you can explore how the interventions effect sizes vary across those studies. So we went through there were around 70 impact evaluations from sub-Saharan Africa, over 4,000 effect sizes that we extracted, not me, team in South Africa and the Philippines team, extracted these effect sizes and then did this meta-analysis. So in this diagram, what's called a forest plot, the vertical line with 0 at the bottom is a line of no effect. And the little box with the line is the 95% confidence interval. So that confidence interval crosses the vertical line, then that meta-analysis is finding no significant effect, which you'll see is the case in the majority of his outcome categories: employment, income, material well-being, and psychological outcomes, all no effect. Okay, that's a shame. There's a bit of an effect on skills, and actually a bigger effect on business. There, as I've said, been mentioned a couple of global reviews already, and what we've got is consistent with those reviews, that business is the area where there's the largest effect. We've got one on program attendance as well. Just ignore that for now. That's people turning up, which hopefully has a large effect. People do turn up there, ask me to program. A lot don't, but at least some do. So this effect size, 0.07, this is what's called a standardized mean difference. And I'm not going to explain that here, an SMD or D or Cohen's D. I'm just going to say this is a small effect. I said it's called Cohen's D. Cohen, who came up with this statistic, he set some thresholds. He said an effect less than 0.2 is small. In social sectors, we rarely see large effects. Cohen was a psychologist doing sort of psychological interventions where you try and change, say, mental health outcomes. You get bigger effects there. In social interventions like the work of why young offending, we've took D as 0.1 as a cutoff point for being small or medium effect. So 0.07, even on that reduced threshold, is still small. What does it mean? So the employment on effect is coming from 55 studies over 1,300 effect sizes, is equivalent to a 3% absolute difference in employment rates. So if you've got a control group and 60% have gone to become unemployed, which is not unusual, that's a common finding in impact evaluations, a large percentage of the control group also enter employment, then you find you only get 63% employment in the treatment group. So 63% in the treatment group, 60% in the control group. This way, outcome monitoring is just so dangerous and misleading, because an outcome monitoring based on so-called results, I wrote a blog about this a couple of weeks ago called the Scourge of Results, would say, oh, 63% of the graduates became employed, the program works. No, 60% of them would become employed if they hadn't taken part in the program. The effect of the program is just a 3% difference. It's not very big. And it's the main thing to take away from this talk. And the 0.07 is the same as been found in the other reviews been done. They find slightly larger in some cases. Basically, it's a small effect. And so youth employment interventions, by and large, don't have large effects. And that's not unique to youth interventions. 80% of programs in development and in developed countries either don't work or have at best small effects. Here's some examples of some study. Youth wage subsidies in South Africa was a study that 3i Finance found that youth receiving a voucher was 7% more likely to be in wage employment after a year. That program got rolled out after the impact evaluation, was actually a policy influence impact evaluation, got rolled out. A subsequent evaluation of the rollout found no effect on employment from youth wage subsidy. Also in South Africa, the Employment Tax Incentive Bill, where there's a tax incentive for employing young people, led to an increase in employment by just 2%. A larger effect was found in a program in Liberia to train ex-combatants, and you found that 16% of them went into farming, which is the idea. So it's an additional 16% compared to the control group. That's quite a large effect. So, but it's not 100%. Only 16% of those being trained went into farming compared to the control group. And then another one is transport subsidies, support job search. So I've forgotten the country for that one, is 7% more likely to be employed after 4 months. So these are examples of the studies we've got and the sort of effects they find. And that's why we're getting this overall effect is not large, because the studies that we're including don't have large effects. And these are the intervention categories broken down. There's not a lot of difference there. Okay, you see training and training with employment support and so on, not a lot of variation. The big difference being where we do find an effect is the effect on multi-component interventions. So we classified interventions being either single component or multi-component. And in this graph, which shows all the different outcomes we've got, the grey bar is multi-component interventions, the effect for desystic, and the orange bar is the single component interventions. And you'll see in nearly all cases, the grey bar is much bigger than the orange bar. If you look at the most employment outcome, probably employment, the desystic multi-component is getting close to 0.2. So it's quite big, whereas that for single component is down there less than 0.02. So you've got an enormous difference between single component and multi-component. The exception is the skills training. When you look at business skills knowledge and skills test scores, single component seems to do better. And so it's not uniformly the case multi-component does best, but on the most important outcomes like employment and earnings, then multi-component interventions are more effective. And this is the first study, the first review to address this question in such a concrete way. And we went beyond that. There's an approach called network meta-analysis. Network meta-analysis allows you to compare between studies when they have common interventions. So what we've done, and to my mind, there's one other study doing this at the moment as well, component network meta-analysis, where we coded the components in each intervention and used them to create a network, comparing effect sizes. And that's also still work in progress, but the top left figure here shows the average effect size across multi-component interventions in that analysis with single component. Again, you see roughly 6-fold larger effect for multi-component interventions compared to single component interventions. Huge difference. There's also a view that maybe combining supply and demand type. Supply side is training and so on. Demand is wage subsidies, public works, and so on. So the Glouvet review 2016 suggested that combining supply and demand was most effective. It didn't have any evidence to support that. It just said, oh, that's most effective. There's weak evidence. Supply alone, D is demand alone, SD is supply and demand. So it's a very small difference in the effect size. The effect size is not big, so going 0.05 to 0.07 is actually quite a large increase. 1.5 from supply and supply, there's not many observations in that cell, so not very robust finding. But the most robust finding in this table at the moment is the top left one, the multi versus single. Okay, we've checked it a couple of different ways. So the obvious question is, well, what combination of what? And these findings, they're not incredibly robust. The thing I would emphasize is that the top two are training plus something. One is training plus information. One is training plus support to employment. And you've got 0.15 and then 0.1, which is a lot down, but still 0.1, compared to training alone, which is one from the bottom at 0.04. So training alone has a much smaller effect than training combined with something else. And you see some other things with training combined. It's not quite so high, but it's still higher than the 0.04. You know, because there are not so many studies in each node of a network, then these findings are not terribly robust. We've got some more studies now to include, so we're updating with another 13 studies to make it a bit more robust. But unfortunately, we need one researcher. We need more research. Yeah, more research needed, despite 1,000 studies, to go a bit further. Let's home in a bit on looking at careers advice. So here's a price plot for careers advice. What's quite common is to separate out the randomized controlled trials from the non-RCTs. And one reason we do that is that non-RCTs tend to find larger effects from RCTs. And that's usually because there's some residual selection bias they've not been able to remove. That may be what's going on here, because we're looking at the effect on employment of these careers advice interventions. We've got a job fairs in Addis Ababa, some careers workshop and job search planning in South Africa, and they're finding no effect, whereas the university curriculum of soft skills and career advice and networking in Rwanda has a big effect. But that difference may also become because the RCTs are all of single component interventions. Whereas the job search planning was added as a second component, made a bit of difference. But as treatment plus, so you can compare treatment plus with treatment, made a bit of difference. But the Rwanda intervention has a lot of stuff, has been networking events, has careers advice, it's teaching life skills through the curriculum. So it's doing a lot of things. So my own view is that difference, this huge effect, 0.69 is a huge effect, is partly biased because there's a Francis score matching, but it's partly also actually true. So they're doing several things that we know work. Networking works, careers advice works, soft skills work, training works, and doing it all together in a university curriculum. And we have process evaluation for that intervention as well. It seemed to have been a good intervention. And so there's sort of true. And so what you take from this is that doing anything alone and single shot interventions around careers, like job fairs, not going to have much effect. Multi-component approaches, particularly longer term, which the university one obviously was, are more likely to have an effect. We also, of course, we're doing a mixed method review, so we've got evidence from the process evaluations too. One of the difference between developed and developing countries, in developed countries, most of employment interventions are targeted what we call needs, not in education, employment or training. They're usually young people left school early, few qualifications, so on. They're quite disengaged from the job market. In developing countries, it's not university so, but a lot of the interventions are targeted at university graduates. And there's some examples in developed countries, but it's quite rare. Whereas in Africa, not unusual to have his intervention. Middle East, even more so, not unusual to have his interventions targeted university graduates. The job fairs invited you, but this is true for intervention in general, not everyone that you invite turns up. And so in the job fair, just over 2/3 of firms turned up, and in Ethiopia, 2/3 of you invited job fair turned up. So you need to over-recruit. People won't turn up. It's like airlines overbook. You should be over-recruiting for your projects. Career guidance is often offered as part of soft skills more generally. We saw the multi-component thing. And there was, in the qualitative studies, very mixed feedback around mentors and supervisors and so on. This actually goes to bullet point 6. It was felt basically if you do soft skills training in an educational setting, particularly say university setting, it's too academic. Whereas if you've got more practical hands-on skills like on the job, that's felt more practical and useful. And point 5 is an obvious one. These events are usually held in the capital, so 90% of the population can't access them. So think about who you're going to reach if you just do your events in the capital. I just wanted to have a couple more slides. Got some common implementation problems coming from the process evaluation for the African studies more generally. There are no surprises here. Common issue of inadequate resources. So things were meant to be done, didn't get done because there was no money for them. Projects get delayed, so usually start 1 or 2 years later than planned. That's usually because of procurement problems, because procurement is made incredibly difficult by ILO or whoever. And so, you're working out in the field in Rwanda somewhere, but has to be approved in Geneva. And so it just takes a long time. So procurement delays are really common. Too short timelines or unrealistic timelines. When I was at the World Bank, we used to look at every completion report, and every project is 5 years in its planning stage. Every project takes 7 years. It's always the case. Why don't you just plan for that? It takes 2 years to start up a project. Why do you think you're going to get started in month 3? It's not going to happen. Okay, so unrealistic timelines, but also too short timelines. Very common feedback from young people was the training was too short to actually acquire these skills, and so particularly if it's a short 2-3 day training. nothing will be achieved. But even for some of the vocational skills, technical skills, let's say 2 weeks isn't enough, 3 weeks is not enough. We need 6 months of this training to really acquire these skills. Coordination between multiple agencies, UN projects, the Norwegians or Japanese decide to finance them through the UN. So every UN agency gets on board, ILO, UNDP, UNICEF, they want a piece of the action. So you've got $10 million, sounds like a lot. Every agency gets 1 million, spread over 5 years. So it's 0.2 million a year. What can you do with that? And you've got to coordinate with different agencies. And it's a nightmare. Weak labour market, so of course it's a problem. You train youth, and then it turns out there's no jobs for them. And so that's clearly an important moderator to use actually in your content analysis. Inappropriate training, so you're not, the trainers are giving, got out-of-date information, they're not up to date with latest information, latest type of skills to be provided, or they're just, it's too academic, it's not on the job market. That's a lot of feedback from employers saying young people coming out of vocational training don't have the right skills we need. Of course, a lot of efforts to engage employers in formulating the training. In the UK, actually, it's something called, again, the name, I was not going to say it, but all the apprenticeship standards are written by employers groups to try and make sure that apprenticeship training is in line with employers' needs. Lack of equipment is linked to lack of resources. So you want to train people in metalwork, there's no welding machines or skives or different equipment that you need for that. You're doing all the work, haven't got the equipment and so on. And sustainability. Sustainability is not thought about, not embedded into project design. So when an externally funded project stops, the whole thing stops. So training centres set up, staff, training trainers done, accreditation, getting new curriculum in line with international standards, and then the project stops, there's no money, nothing happens anymore after that. So you have to think about sustainability. This is a very introductory. The toolkit will look like the YF toolkit I showed you earlier, but we started to think about what stuff looks like. And basically everything is low impact, except when it's done with something else, and some of the things have moderate impact. Apart from life skills by itself is all a moderate impact. Strength of evidence is actually reasonable for most things. And the cost, of course, is varied. Giving money to people and training people is quite costly. But other things, actually, like life skills training and business services, business mentoring, so on, can be quite low cost. This is really rudimentary. We're doing technical reports still to back up what's going to go in there. So it's work in progress being done over the next 3 months before this gets up. Finally, some general reflections. I've done a similar mixed method review for high-income countries, now do one for African countries. So just some reflections comparing them. It's important to do for those of you on the call coming from developed country background, we come from a different context. And though we may have worked different for our lives, so I understand, I always worked in Africa, I understand Africa, you don't. Okay, you don't really get what these differences are and how important they are. So one I've mentioned, get a job versus make a job. The second I've mentioned, that the programs in African countries may target better off youth and more disadvantaged. I don't think that's a good thing, I'm just stating a fact. It's a positive statement, not a normative one. The most important we don't appreciate is a system versus no system. So in developed countries, I live in Germany, I'm from UK, and in Europe in particular, there's a system. So a young person gets unemployed, the welfare service knows about this and refers them to the employment service. Often most countries are the same agents. In some countries like Ireland, they're separate, but they have a referral system. So an automatic referral system into a system that will provide you training or some other sort of support. That does not exist in African countries. Okay, so when you do a project in African countries, you have to identify who is eligible, who would want to recruit for this intervention, how do we find them, how are we going to recruit them, how are we going to encourage them to come. Most developed countries have some form of work fair. They want to refer to a program, you have to go or you lose your benefits. Nothing like that in developed countries. So how are we going to persuade people to come, given they've got to live and they've got some informal social activity going on that's actually keeping them alive, paying for their food every day. So how are we going to get them to come? Amazingly to me, the evaluations in this space are really quite an issue. In developed countries, well, it's not an issue. They talk a lot about recruitment, in referral recruitment. But in Africa, most evaluations don't talk about this issue. And to me, it's a crucial issue. How do you identify, target, recruit the right people? So it's really undervalued. I blame partly for DAC evaluation criteria. One of the UN reports says DAC evaluation criteria doesn't include this issue. I mean, it could do under relevance, but relevance is normally badly treated. And so this key issue is not treated. Pathways to employment. So again, so I live in Germany where we have dual education model. So you've got pathways to employment decided when you're 11. depending on which type of school you go to. You can switch a bit later on, but basically you go into vocational training, into apprenticeship, into a job. There's a pathway to employment there, and it's laid out. And if you speak to people in developed countries, like I work with what Centre for Youth Employment in the UK, this terminology, pathways to employment, is a standard part of the terminology. So what is this pathway to employment to make the transition from school to work and so on? That vocabulary is missing in developing countries. When I spoke to the Decent Jobs for Youth staff in the World Bank, they weren't familiar with the term pathways into employment because there's no system in place to support those pathways. So I'm on the last bullet now. Work experience for high school students. So we have our youngest daughter is in the last year of high school. She had to go for work experience for a couple of days in her last year, and this year she had to take 2 weeks out to go into work experience in some local enterprise or whatever she chose. And and then if you're in a vocational training scheme, in Indonesia, but you're in a vocational training scheme, then you're getting work experience even more at a younger age level. And then you'll get there's a link where you go from your work experience while you're at school, that person takes you on as an apprenticeship, then as a trainee, and then as an employee, you're employed, for which time you still get training as well. So they've got this work experience for high school students built on these pathways to employment, and these systems don't exist. So you see German projects where they go and try and put in place a dual education model in a country where the system doesn't exist to support it. So it's not going to work. You've got to think about, okay, they can say, okay, I'm going to try and build that system, but you've got to have, you think about apprenticeship standards, and the system doesn't exist for that. And then there might be a national vocational board or whatever, but actually whether those standards are relevant and being applied in vocational training takes place, I know from the evaluations, it's very doubtful. It doesn't happen. So there's just a lot of bits of a system missing. And a lot of agencies say, oh, we do systems level interventions, but not terribly well. That's what I can say from looking at the evaluations. So, and you can't, I mean, in a way, there's so much needed in terms of building institutions, that system to exist. It needs a really long-term undertaking. And then, of course, then the underlying education and employment system, and employment conditions have to be there for that. Okay. So thanks again to all the team members. So I've been talking, but everything I've said has come from work done by other people named on this slide. So thank you all to them, and thank you. So I'll stop sharing now. I see some questions have come in the Q&A. So let me have a look at those and see if I can make sense of them. Okay. And I'll try to go to the top first of all. And work my way down. Okay. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, people are encouraged to other events in this program during this evaluation week. So please do that. When registered for my talk, we're going to talk for other talks. And not going to introducing themselves. Okay. Oh, I'm on the chat. Sorry, that's why that's happening. Okay. Okay, so there's a question about building evidence architecture. So, and should you do a project for that? I really wish that's what people would do. So I have a slide I've not put into this presentation, which is I call the practice project policy program evidence-based cycle, which talks about identifying interventions or policies or practice, whatever, from existing evidence, and then you need to do other types of formative research to design something in your context and do formative evaluation, and then initial efficacy testing and effectiveness testing through reviews. So it's a cycle. That's for individual interventions. Then there's architecture. It's a sector-wide initiative. And the global funds like GPE and social accountability, child protection, ending violence against this, that, and the other, they should all be doing what I say, not because I say it, because it's a sensible way to do it, of building the evidence map, doing the evidence map, and identify the reviews, evidence-based products. And WHO is doing this already in its existing way, but the WHO parts work on elder abuse and isolation approached me to adopt this approach, and are doing this as a project. As I saw from the toolkit, there's various what works in the UK. They've also adopted this approach and are working with us to build their toolkits based on evidence mapping. So I'd really like more agencies, particularly research councils, doing evidence mapping. But anyone interested in doing research in areas, just look for an existing evidence map. That's why I do the map of maps. So people can use the map of maps, identify existing maps, and see where there is research and there's not research. The map of maps was used by us to identify areas of interest to the funder, what was then different in FCGO, where there are no maps they're interested in. So we did maps on transport, access to justice and disability based on there not being maps in those areas, based on gaps in a map of maps. Okay, so USAID employment framework. So actually, when we first did the map of the evidence and gap map, we looked at a lot of frameworks, including USAID one at that time, and that's going back 5 years now. We started the work to identify the structure we got and what needs to be done is to you're quite right around context. That's why guidelines are important to identify what works in what context and to identify. And so that's what you said about the ecosystem influencing employment generation. And so there are issues around what's going to work here. And the other issues around gender and green economy, they actually are in the map, so you can filter all those, look at the relevant studies. And so the map could be used, some of our users use the map itself to collect studies areas of interest, but the review should be done actually around these key issues. So if someone's got a strategy, they were interested in this particular type of approach, like green economy, where there's not a lot of studies, green and circular economy for youth employment, then they should do a review of what's there already to help inform their strategy. So they can go back to the map to look for that and come to us to help do a review, or they can look for existing reviews, but they won't find reviews on that topic. No, we're looking at both supply, the question about supply and demand side. We look at both supply and demand side interventions. They do have to be interventions. So we're not looking just at, what other demand side constraints would exist. We're looking at interventions to address demand side issues. Design implementation relates to what design issues we might find. So what design factors are there? So like targeting. So when I say of interventions, target not just disadvantaged youth, also university graduates, that's we coded who the target group were. When I said a lot of problem with procurement delays, that's an implementation issue. So we've coded things like, does the graduate have a theory of change? Does it present the intervention design? A lot don't. Does it present what implementation issues occurred, either barriers or facilitators, things that helped people take part or not, things that help achieve the outcomes or not, and what does it discuss sustainability? So when I said sustainability is not embedded in program design, that's a finding from that part of the study. Okay, so this issue around general interventions might favour youth. That's true. And of course, general macro interventions for growth and so on might favour youth employment in general and youth employment. We couldn't include those. It was an employment intervention and it wasn't solely for youth, but did include majority youth in its target group. And it had a breakdown of age, so we could tell that. Then it did get included. There's an issue on scale. I see that Jessica is saying thanks to everyone. I've got 15 minutes still. I'm going to go through the question and finish. So the fact is, and we were in the first version of the map coding scale because MasterCard wanted it, but the data is very not very clear usually. Studies normally, impact evaluations report their sample size, not the program size. They're not the same thing. Process evaluators may report a number, but they're often, they call it numbers reached. They can be numbers potentially reached. I know this since many years, that process evaluations overstate numbers because they say there are this many youth in the area where we worked. So they could all have come if they wanted to. And they didn't, but they could have done. So numbers reached are often overstated. So it's really hard to talk about scale. And so a lot of what we've got are actually small scale interventions, and small scale interventions tend to be more effective than once they've got to scaled up. That's across sectors. Many are very often found that things don't work once they're taken to scale. Yes, the PowerPoint is going to be sent around to everyone along, and you can go back and view the presentation online on the GGN YouTube channel. Are there critiques of evidence? There are lots of critiques of evidence, but this is not, I'm afraid I don't have the time and place to discuss them here. I've done so in many other places. But more critical issues, but what you're talking about against employment displacement effects, they are important. And so this is surprising actually. So in the uh, economic labour market literature, we have this concept of creaming, of just taking the best candidates for your training, for example, and of dead weight loss, where you train people who would have otherwise been trained somewhere else anyway. These concepts are used a bit in developed country literature, not that much. They're not used at all in the African literature. So the impact evaluations don't refer to these economic concepts are used in labour market studies. Yeah, so we're trying to do a mixed method review. That would be very helpful. There's a question about how you combine precedent and methodology evidence. That'd be helped a great deal if actually we had some more mixed method studies, but we have very few. But the mixed method review we started on, and basically my approach to doing that is look at the evidence along the causal chain. And and if you have low participation rates, if you have weak implementation, they undermine impact. So what we hope to see, not because it's a good thing, because it's consistent with our view of how these things look, is that where you have weak implementation and so on, then of course you have lower effect. YEF has different from YSET, and YEF is a what works centre. So YEF is promoting evidence-based budgeting, basically, that there are some funds available from the funds I mentioned to ever do interventions that are based on the evidence. YF does fund some interventions itself, but that's not its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is to actually collect the evidence and present the evidence on what works. Okay, so on where's my evidence coming from? We've got an evidence gap map of 1,000 studies. These are evaluations of youth employment programs across the world. We identified them through a database search, many academic databases, and we searched all major agency websites where we thought we would find relevant studies. That included, of course, the Development Evaluation Clearinghouse, or sorry, Development Experience Clearinghouse of USAID, through our database, of course, and so on. And it's an evidence database reported despite what they call it. Where would I like to see the first EPDMPs? All of those areas. I work across a number of areas. I'm always pushing them to EPDMPs. And every time I'm engaged in a sector, I'm saying, now let's do some guidelines. Let's do a checklist. Let's do whatever I think is most important. If it's quite broad, I say let's do a toolkit. My computer might die, so then the session will abruptly end. Let's do a toolkit. Let's do guidelines, depending on what seems most appropriate. In one case, we've done for child protection, we've actually done an evidence gap map where the evidence is included in the map itself. The findings are cell-wise findings in the map. And I'm trying to get other people to take that up as well. It needs quite a small map for that to work. That map only has 100 studies in it. When you've got a big study like this, then you can't do it. But we're hoping we're doing an evidence, what is it, a rapid review I think it's we're doing a map for FCDO on conflict and trust prevention right now. And we're hoping that is planned to be followed up with some rapid reviews. So there will be some reviews in the area, and we will hope, we're trying to get people involved in build the top levels of the pyramid. I mean, it's obvious that you should like to do this. We look at when we look at the budget, and the component has to be at least 10% to get counted to be included in the coding. So, and you're right, sometimes 95% is training, then it just goes as training. So it might be multi-component de facto, there's a small amount of something else, often institution building, a tiny bit of institution building, Ministry of Labour, whatever. And so that might not get included. Those components are rarely evaluated anyway. We have coded them under policy and institutions category in our map if it's there, but actually the evaluation on that side is very weak. How do I get, last question from Li Ping. She knows the answer to this question. How do we get the data on cost toolkit? It's very hard. So most of what work centres in the end, we say we'll get the data from the included studies, they don't have it. So most of what work centres actually go to collect their own cost data by talking to practitioners in the UK because that's their market of interest. The thing about cost data is they vary enormously across context. In the French World Bank study, different cost in textbooks. I think it's Senegal and I think a neighbouring country, I forget which, but there's massive difference in unit cost. So the normal approach to costing is take a unit cost approach. So actually, YFF, Youth Foundation, from the UK, they used our theories of change we put together for each intervention to identify the ingredients you need to do the interventions, and thereby identify what the intervention should be. So what the components you need, what ingredients you need for each component. And based on the ingredients approach, you can go to people and say, what would this cost you? So the recommended approach from Cochran Campbell to doing costing is an ingredients approach, and then we can try and cost it up. We can, once we've got the list of ingredients, we can see, well, this just takes like 2 trainer person weeks plus a bit of preparation. This is 6 months training. So we can make our high or low cost estimates based on the ingredients. We haven't done that properly yet. So what I showed you is very back of the envelope. Okay, thank you, everyone. There's no more. I mean, there's someone who's never seen the Elizabeth Triangle, never seen the Epton Triangle. I've been very, very sad to hear that. So I've been talking about it for the last 6 years now. So please go. So the link will be in what we send out. We'll send out a couple other links as well. And please do sign up to the GGN newsletter. We'll send out a link to that. And follow the work of the other various groups I'm involved with, like the Africa Centre and the Centre for Space Science in Lanjou, and the various other researchers I work with. So thank you all again, and have a good evening. Bye-bye.